My name is George Galloway, presenter of Kalima Hurra on Almayadeen television. Morning to you. I don't mince my words. I speak Kalima Hurra, and my audience does too. Kalima Hurra, free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. Welcome to Kalima Hurra with me, George Galloway, coming to you from London on Almayadeen television, but talking about events unfolding around the world of particular importance in the Muslim world. What lies behind the provocative burnings of the Quran in Sweden, and for that matter in Denmark? Is it merely an excess of liberal zeal for freedom of speech and expression? Well, that would be condemnable enough, in my opinion. People should not have their religion, their prophets, and so on, routinely and for no reason that can be ascertained, insulted, denigrated, and the rest. But the double standards of countries in the West on the subject of liberalism, free speech, and free expression render that an insufficient explanation for what happened. Charlie Hebdo, we are told, has to be tolerated in the interests of free expression, even though it, metaphorically speaking, has burned more than the Quran. But the attempt by anyone in virtually any Western country to tell the truth about the Israel-Palestine question would very quickly lead to you losing your job, losing your elected political office, being expelled from your chosen political party, being banned and censored on social media, and quite possibly even being prosecuted. So there's no free speech when it comes to Palestine and Israel. There's no free speech when it comes to the Ukraine war. Your television station will be closed down if it doesn't suit the prevailing narrative. There's no freedom of expression for people who want to strike a note that is not in consistency with the prevailing narrative. All of that free speech and free expression has been closed down. And then there's the geopolitical issues that are raised. Where was this Quran burned in Sweden? Outside the Turkish embassy. Turkey, a member of NATO and possessing the veto power on Sweden's application to join NATO, which they duly vetoed. But maybe the Swedish government didn't really want to join NATO, knew that the burning of the Quran outside the Turkish embassy would be likely to anger the Turks. Indeed, it angered everyone around the Muslim world. There were demonstrations as far away as Indonesia. It was denounced by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar, by all the Gulf countries. It was denounced routinely around the Muslim world. But Turkey had the power over Sweden's military political destiny and has used it. All sorts of conspiracy theories have now sprung forth. Was this a Russian plot to scupper Sweden's attempt to join the NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the US-led military alliance? Who was behind it? What are the limits of freedom of speech and expression? I think it's a subject worth exploring. With my panel of distinguished experts, I'm merely the enthusiastic amateur, as always. Kristiane Backer, My old friend is a television presenter, an art dealer, and the author of a book with one of the best titles in anybody's library, From MTV to Mecca. That's the journey she made. Kristiane, welcome to Kalimahorra.
Thank you so much.
What did you think when you saw the Quran being burned? Did you smell the burning or did you smell a rat?
I smelled a rat. No, I felt sorry. I felt upset that people go out and do these things in our day and age where we should be, respectful towards each other. I mean, everybody knows Islamophobia it shouldn't happen. It's something so backward. And why would you burn anybody's holy book? And then outside...
But you get lunatics in every society, don't you? The man who burned it was a far-right activist, well-known Islamophobe. He'd previously burned Qurans all over the place. Why did he do it now? And why was the reaction as it was now?
Well, I think, isn't he on a tour, or hasn't he been on a tour around Sweden?
Book-burning tour.
Book-burning tour, yeah. I mean, they are quite powerful, the right-wing party in Sweden. That is what is worrying.
Yeah, his party supports the ruling coalition.
Yeah, and generally in Europe, that Islamophobia is actually not getting better, but it seems to be getting worse due to the populist right-wing movement. That I find worrying. And would he not... do you think he didn't want Sweden to get into NATO? I don't think that's got anything to do with it, but it's a consequence that probably the Swedish government didn't...
I think that anyone who thought about it for more than 30 seconds would say burning the Quran outside the Turkish embassy is going to make Turkey extremely angry, and Turkey has the power of veto on Sweden's application to join NATO.
I think the West seems to be so hung up with their freedom of speech clauses in the Constitution. Oh yeah, of course. When you're saying Islam is great, like I did in the 90s, in the early 90s, I lost all my jobs.
Yeah, and
it's a double standard.
Somebody liked one of my tweets about Palestine and has just been kicked out of the Labour Party for liking a tweet of mine about Palestine. Not kicked out of the party, but kicked out as a candidate for the local elections in Stoke in May. We'll come back to these deeper questions. Morad Koreshi, you were a member of the London Assembly under both Ken Livingstone's mayoralty and Boris Johnson. London is a place where these kind of things happen, and indeed counterpoints to them happen. If you don't mind my saying so, you're a kind of liberal fellow. Do you stand up for the rights of people to burn any book they like?
Let's get the history right. Most of the book burners in European history have been fascists. And it's quite clearly the case in this instance as well. And there's been a clear pattern all the way through history, from the Nazis and the book burning they did in the 30s. So that's how I categorise people when I hear book burning, whatever complexion and whatever they may be. And I, as a liberal Muslim, will defend the Quran in this respect, that actually, to its credit, I would suggest, it does mention Aisha, Jesus Christ, over 70 times, and Musa, Moses, over 100 times. Now, many of these buggers won't know this or appreciate this, or the Islamophobes, but it just shows, I think, Islam's relationship with the Christian Jewish tradition. It's always been in that family, whereas I think most people don't even appreciate that. I think the best thing I can do, and what I've always done with platforms like this, is explain that. I'm no theologian, but I know that much, and I was taught that much by my parents.
Batul Subeiti is an energy engineer, a particularly important field nowadays, but also a political analyst and writer and human rights activist. Go on, say what you were going to say.
Freedom of expression is all about expressing your thoughts, your ideas, your philosophy. It's not about trespassing on other people's rights. It is not about attacking what others consider to be holy. And it's certainly not about creating an environment of intolerance, an environment of hate, and an environment where the seeds of sedition are being provoked, right? We all know the famous mantra, divide and conquer. As a prerequisite to imperialist states conquering, they would essentially divide society. So these these have a real tangible impact on the ground. Or if we look at color revolutions and coups, right, a prerequisite to that is causing soft war strategies like psyopses and psychological operations that can cause discords between the nations. And look, Sweden comes and it heralds itself as a multicultural society, right? It speaks of, on the 1970s, for example, how it opened, immigration cultural centers. In 2015, they allowed, I believe, over 150,000 refugees from Iraq, from Syria, from Afghanistan. So on the one hand, they talk about human rights and human values. And on the other hand, the aspects that really jeopardize the growth and the integration of this multiculturalism, the advancement of society, what allows the seeds of discord and ultimately the fueling of the far-right fanaticism that ultimately leads to terrorism being more rife. We know what the ramifications of these actions are. History speaks for itself. For these issues, there seems to be a contradiction between the two. So the way that I would label and frame the issue of attacks on religion of this magnitude as a hate crime, in the same way that we talk about racism and sexism as being discrimination that is of a hate crime nature, that should be prosecuted. Likewise, here you are tapping into the sensibilities of billions of individuals across the globe. And I would argue that it's actually more offensive to actually attack something that individuals consider sacred to their heart than, for example, the color of their skin. So I'd argue that this is actually something worse, given the ramifications that it's having on wider society and the breakup of essentially the moral fabric.
Well, is it more of an attack than occupying the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, for example, desecrating it, settlers, armed settlers firing weapons in it? Yet none of these Muslim countries broke their either overt or covert relationships with Israel when these things happened. The point I'm trying to make is, why does everyone get so hot under the collar about a solitary far-right fanatic burning the holy book, and yet are perfectly happy to maintain even official diplomatic relations with a state which is occupying one of the holiest places in Islam? Is that not hypocrisy?
Right, absolutely, because Islam isn't the determining factor and the true identity for the people and the society. I would argue that probably the Islamic Republic of Iran is the only country in which that is the case, because its principles overshadow its nation's interests. But in a place like Turkey, for example, it's more so symbolic. It uses Islam in the symbolic virtue sense, and we have to look at it from the lens of political interests and gains. So why is Turkey doing this right now? It's masking it under the cover of obviously not wanting Sweden to join NATO, because it wants to gain, certain concessions from Sweden, for example. We also have to look at it from the fact that this also bolsters the image of Erdogan for the Muslim Ummah, especially even for the Turks. When he appeals and says this is an attack on 85 million Turks within the country, he is sending a signal ahead of his election as well. Like, I am someone to be trusted. I am someone who will champion the rights of the Muslims on an international scene by words. But these are empty words, because the reality speaks for itself. If you support an occupation and you normalize with this occupation, that if you look at the majority of the people within the lands, even if we take Jordan, for example, that normalized in the 1990s, still 95% of the country in the recent poll that the Cradle media did shows that they don't support the Zionist regime and the normalization.
But the rulers denouncing Sweden have open diplomatic relations with Israel and never break them, no matter what crime Israel commits. And many of those crimes are at least as serious as burning a Quran, is, I think, my point. Let's cross over to Sweden, where Jan Oberg is the co-founder and director of Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research. He's a conflict reporter and analyst with an important independent think tank in Lund in Sweden. Jan, welcome to the show.
My pleasure.
I mean, the authorities, the government in Stockholm, effectively gave a green light to this far-right extremist to carry out the desecration of the Holy Quran. As a Danish, Swedish citizen yourself, how do you see it?
Well, I'm not a Swedish citizen, but I'm a Danish citizen who lived here for more than 50 years. But of course, I know Rasmus Paludan because he is a Danish politician. who tried to get into the parliament. So I know what he's up to. He's burnt these Qurans in Copenhagen too, elsewhere. I think it's a very stupid thing to do. That's a kind of, it's not a very polite or diplomatic way of expressing it. I don't simply see the purpose of doing things like that. When I saw that it was done, I was wondering whether this would not come under a law that, as far as I know, exists here, which is that it's criminal or you can be persecuted if you incite hatred against a particular group of people. And of course, he may not have shouted and screamed and said things, but he's burned a Quran. And I can't see that that should not be the same as inciting hatred. But he's a lawyer, educated man, so he probably knows the fine details of how far you can go. Interestingly enough, when somebody else shortly after wanted to do the same thing, the answer was no. So I don't know whether Sweden has some kind of principles or not, but it happened also when a big doll of President Erdogan was hung outside one of the public buildings in Stockholm. So I would say this goes back to a long tradition. It goes back to the Danish cartoons, and it's very tragic to see that there are people in Europe who still are racist, who still run this kind of hatred mongering against Muslims, a group of people, a religion, and a national group that we have, the West has conducted warfare on again and again and again. I've been to these places with the exception of Afghanistan. I've been to Iraq, I've been to Iran, I've been to Syria, I've seen Bosnia, and I wonder why it is that we cannot grow up in Europe and behave ourselves. If some Muslim in Stockholm had burned a copy of the Bible, you should have seen the headlines.
This incident happened in Sweden, carried out by a Danish, as you said. Is there any reason for that?
I fail to remember whether he was once and for all prevented from doing these things in Copenhagen or in Denmark in general. There was a reason some year or two ago that he went to Sweden. I must honestly say I have other things to do in my life than following this man's crazy activity. But I think Sweden should have learned also by now that if you want to live in security, and this is happening at a moment when Sweden has applied for NATO membership. So everybody's talking about security in this country. I don't believe NATO gives security, but that's another issue. If you do that, you also have to take others into account and their feelings and their cultural pride. And if there's one thing we've always historically been proud of in Scandinavia, it was that we took each other into consideration. We had different foreign policy and security political solutions. We had NATO membership, we had neutrality, we had a special arrangement for Finland vis-a-vis the Soviet Union at the time, etc. We always said we are secure when we have thought of what will our action imply for the other Nordic countries. Now, if somebody does these things and only thinks of his own nation or his own government or his own parochial, narrow-minded interests, I think we're far out compared with just 20 years ago when we had decent foreign policies and decent security politics, and where Sweden would not have allowed that type of hate inciting activity as Mr. Paludan's.
Well, the Europeans are always telling us that the rights of free speech and free expression are, well, to coin a phrase, sacred to them. Do they really mean it?
I don't know whether it's a pretext. I think it has been a genuine part of at least the self-understanding of Western culture that we had a serious attitude to human rights, to freedom of expression, to free media. But of course, that has never meant freedom from responsibility of the consequences of what you do. I mean, there are lots of things I can do, but because of being a civilized, educated person, I don't do it because I know it would lead to serious troubles with somebody else or make somebody sad. Civilization is about being able to abstain from doing what you could do. Civilization is to say, no, I'm not doing this, although I could get away with doing it, but it's morally wrong. And if I look at how easy it has been to make, I don't know, 98%, 95% of West Europeans hate Russians in a few days. I'm appalled by this development, because if there's one thing we should have learned, it is the distinction that everybody else does in the world about us and the US, namely, if you go to Iran and you travel around, I've been a lot to Iran, I've been to other countries that have political reasons to hate the West. But what the people say in these countries is, we can distinguish between the government and the people. We don't hate the Americans, but we dislike or hate the government of the US and Washington. Now, if we are not that civilized in Europe that we can hate a whole 150 million Russians, because this is collective punishment with the sanctions, with the no musicians coming here playing, all these kinds of no tourists coming here anymore. This is a punishment of the whole people for what a leadership have done in something the same people call a dictatorship. In a dictatorship, the citizens are not responsible for what the leadership does. I don't subscribe to the idea that it's a dictatorship, but that's how people who hate consider it.
I mean, the Muslims in Europe and indeed across the world are being told that these kind of actions in the name of free speech are normal and should be normalized. That's dangerous, isn't it? What do you think?
Well, that is absolutely what it is. That's absolutely what it is. The way the West or NATO countries led by the US has killed in Muslim countries, how much we have destroyed. I've been to Syria. I was in Syria in December 2016 when Aleppo was liberated from al-Nusra, 4.5 years of occupation by the Syrian forces and the Russian forces. And now, of course, there's a terrible earthquake and everything is worse than it was. But we managed to kill 300,000 to 400,000 Syrians. We made 6 to 8 million people flee from their homes, either internally in Syria or leaving as refugees, UNIDPs or refugees. We've destroyed the economy. The Americans still have a number of bases, not sure whether it's 8 or 10 or whatever it is, on Syrian territory. Nobody gave them a right to have that. Now, if we expect these types of things, Iraq, the harassment since 79 of Iran, etc., the destruction of Libya, if we expect that not to have a negative effect on world politics and cultural dialogue, we are more stupid than we're allowed to be as Europeans. So I'm saying we are on the wrong track.
Amazing. You can either yourself or assisting others massacre hundreds of thousands of Muslims in Muslim countries, but you can still not accept that in Sweden a single Quran can be burned. That's the double standards and the hypocrisy to which I object. I'll be right back with the second half of Kalima Horra. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra on Almayadeen television with me, George Galloway, coming from London, but discussing Scandinavia, book burnings, and Muslim leaders' hypocrisies. Well, one man that I've worked with for decades knows a thing or two about these matters. He is Dr. Anas Altacriti. He's the CEO and indeed the founder of the Cordoba Foundation, which aims to bridge the gap of understanding between the Muslim world and the West. Good luck with that. Dr. Anas, welcome to the show.
It's an absolute pleasure, George. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Dr. Anas, why did the Swedish government allow a far-right political figure to burn a copy of the Holy Quran? Where is this hate coming from?
I mean, it's undoubtedly an act of inciting hatred. There's absolutely no question about it. Although that Sweden and some commentators, and definitely those who supported Rasmus Paludan in his despicable act, tried to parade this as some sort of glorification of freedom of speech or freedom of expression or the such. But in reality, it did nothing but to incite hatred, to legitimize to an extent the desecration of something that 2 billion people around the world hold quite holy, sanctimonious, sacred, quite dear to their hearts. The question that belies or beggars belief is, why would a country only 10 years ago described as one of the most liberal, one of the most welcoming, one of the most open, one of the most open to migrants from around the world, but suddenly it feels that it's by this act feels that it's okay to hurt, to damage the relationship with, and to make okay to desecrate and to offend 2 billion people around the world. It's something that is absolutely unbelievable.
Does this action and the Swedish police's reaction to it, namely to protect it, give a green light to any Swedish citizen to denigrate any religion in any way that it pleases?
Well, I mean, you'd think that the ideal of freedom of speech goes across the board. I mean, that's what one would normally assume when talking about a country as advanced, as technologically sort of modeling itself and the such. You'd think that that is true. But it seems, and we found out only a few days later, that when someone wanted to or applied to hold a gathering in order to burn a copy of the Torah, the holy book of the Jews, that was rejected. Now, I'm glad it was rejected. I am against burning any book whatsoever, let alone a book that is held dear to its followers and to those who consider it sacred and holy. So, but the mere fact that Sweden prevented the burning of the Torah just means that its claim that burning the Quran was some sort of act whereby freedom of speech was being exemplified is absolutely false.
Isn't the question why the Swedish authorities allowed this to happen? And what about the perpetrators? What did they hope to achieve?
It's something, George, I'm going to be honest here. I think that firstly, most would agree that burning a copy of the Holy Quran is not going to either lessen Islam, it's not going to lessen the mass conversion to Islam as we're seeing across the world. And, with the fact that we have billions and billions of copies of the Holy Quran, and, it's not that we're all of a sudden finding ourselves wanting copies of the Holy Quran. What I think that this does do, however, is to reflect a deep anxiety and a deep lack of confidence and probably even a crisis within not only Sweden, but also Europe. Bear in mind that Paludan is Danish. And in Denmark, we've had now years and years of various acts, whether it be cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, or whether it be cartoons depicting Muslims, or whether it be the burning of the Holy Quran, or the desecration of icons that are close to Islam and Muslims. It's been on this path for years. And every single time I hear about this, and by the way, other European countries as well, every single time I hear about this, I ask myself, why? And the only conclusion I can come to is the fact that these countries and Europe as a whole is in crisis mode, about who Europeans are. What do they represent? What do they believe in? What are the real values of justice, democracy, freedom, equality, freedoms of speech, freedoms of belief, when we find many of those countries subjugating Muslims, harassing Muslim women for wearing the hijab, attacking Islamic centers and mosques because they're frequented by Muslims, and so on and so forth. There is an actual crisis in what Europe now represents, in what the West generally, probably even speaking, what it stands for, what it believes in, and the way in which to clutch at whatever straw it may have within its midst. It's to propose that there is an other, and that other at this moment of time is conveniently Islam and Muslims, for whatever reasons they are. It's a way of justifying the wars, justifying the occupations, justifying the legacy of colonialism and of stealing and pillaging, the sources of countries, most of which happen to be Muslim countries.
It's a potentially dangerous provocation, isn't it? What if some Muslims decide to retaliate in a violent and destructive way?
Well, I hope not. I mean, there's a great saying by the Libyan warrior against Italian colonialism in the mid or early 20th century, Umar al-Mukhtar, when some of his followers said, well, why don't we do to them like they do to us? They burn our houses, they rape our women, they steal our food, they enslave our children. His response to them was simply, they are not our teachers. We do not do tit for tat, George. And therefore, I really hope not. And you know what? Thankfully, we haven't seen the kind of reaction that many warned that Muslims would go. We haven't seen Muslims hit the streets and go on rampages and burn down buildings and probably desecrate sacred icons of other faiths or other cultures. I'm glad, and I have to say I'm quite proud of Muslims across Europe and elsewhere, because this act is a small act done by a small person and accepted, unfortunately, I have to say, by a government that seems to be quite small itself.
That is, Kristiane, the most important point, isn't it? The last one that Anas made. The police stood guard around this man while he committed this crime. Well, it isn't a crime in Sweden, although it would have been a crime, apparently, a few days later to burn another holy book, demonstrating the absurd double standards that I talked about earlier. You can't legislate for an individual fool or provocateur. But the state of Sweden did legislate for their own security forces to guard him while he did it. Is this madness or badness on their part?
Both, a bit of both. and foolishness, yeah, indeed, because they didn't realize the consequences. A, the NATO ascension that is now in question. B, the consequences within Sweden in terms of their safety, because what would it lead to? It would anger all the Muslims in Sweden and perhaps radicalize them, or some of them, some who are liable to that. So it won't make Sweden safer in every way. So it's a very foolish thing to do. But how do we remedy this? I think some questions were raised before. What is the real reason for it all? I think a lack of education, a lack of understanding of what Islam really is, that Islam actually, the true Islamic values are very much European values. And that seems to be something completely missing generally in the European conscious.
But the Muslims are not blameless in that. The picture for the general public in Europe over the last decade has been a picture of ISIS, of Al-Qaeda, of head chopping and throat cutting, supported, aided and abetted by our own governments, I may say. But that's the picture. If, my mother is 87 or 88 years old. she only watches the mainstream news. That's probably the picture in her mind about the Muslims.
Understandably so. The media has a very conscious role to play. They should not give only airtime to the monsters, to the radicals. Sadly, the extremists overshadow any media discourse. I think European institutions need to do a very conscious effort to eradicate the institutional Islamophobia within the institutions. They also need to do something in the public conscience, in the media, for them to be more responsible in their reporting, and generally an education program of what the true Islam really is, so that we distinguish between extremism and true Islam, and promote the true Islam, and and obviously stop this kind of burning or hate crimes should not be allowed.
But then, George, it's also a question of who owns the media, right? So the media is either owned by the government or it's owned by billionaires who have direct contracts. So even if we, for example, look at the likes of Rupert Murdoch, who owns News Corp, for instance, we see that between 2015 and 16, he went into Downing Street in 1 year, 18 times, basically. And he was very pro-Brexit. And we saw the Brexit referendum because he was pushing it through his mass media. So I agree with you in the sense that the masses are inherently and innately victims of the status quo that is being perpetuated by those who have the monopoly. Because not only is it a case that Islam is not associated with extremism, they create this extremism. So they create the problem precisely because they want to yield a situation of Islamophobia where they can basically garner political interests from that reality that they have created, which is, maybe colonizing, maybe it's getting the oil, maybe it's having a strategic positioning in certain locations across the globe, but then also in the aspect of cultural hegemony. So that's the hard war, but there's also the soft war. And a part of the soft war is allowing that hatred to basically foster towards the Muslims, to also develop this kind of inferiority complex within the Muslims. So Muslims feel like they can't stand up, or that they are not tolerated. So Muslims not tolerating this kind of behavior is how it should be. For Muslims to sit down and say, do you know what, we tolerate this and we won't say anything about this, that allows this injustice to perpetuate itself.
Yeah, but it wasn't the media that were cutting people's throats and chopping their heads
They're
off.
a part of the same system.
It was people who called themselves Muslims.
Okay, so these people that called themselves Muslims,
and there weren't a few of them.
They were brainwashed.
There were hundreds of thousands of them.
If we want to talk about the Wahhabi ideology, where did that come from? Where did Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab come from? Saudi Arabia as a monarchy state was put there precisely by the West, by Britain, by this, supposed great country, right? Who actually gave their ideas leverage and allowed them to rule the country and everything in between, and to even call the country after that monarchy to serve their callous interests. Today, Saudi Arabia and even this Wahhabist ideology has no inherent strength in and of itself, apart from the propping and the ruling that the West is giving it. It's giving it that kind of cover, essentially.
Murad, you're one of the leaders of the anti-war movement, the peace movement in Britain, executive of the campaign for nuclear disarmament and so on. You must see acts like the one that we're talking about, or the ones that we are talking about, as contributing to basically boiling geopolitical situation in the world that can erupt into flames at any time.
Indeed, and that's a very dangerous situation. And in some ways, we should be grateful the Swedish government has changed its position. But it's caused damage already. We've had counter-demonstrations in London in front of the Swedish embassy, and Lord knows where else it's gone. So I think the Swedes have got to take responsibility for this and realise the mistake they've made, and also not fall for this storyline that we've had. When I was growing up in the 70s and 80s in London, no one asked me whether I was a Muslim or not. It didn't even register. It was only in the 90s and the beginning of the century. And it just shows how things shift. Unfortunately, hatred is a constant. In the 70s and 80s, it was black or Pakistani or Indian, that was the issue. That's changed in the early end of this last century and the beginning of the century. I think it's changing again now. I think it's moving now to Russians and the Chinese. Well, certainly if you listen to the BBC, that's the impression you'll get. Unfortunately, that's a constant in British politics. I've seen it in London. If you looked at the National Front's activities at the 70s and 80s again, there was a constant 5% far-right vote there. And they never got into power, thankfully, in London, in the regional government, the GLC, or in any of the parliamentary seat, because the vote wasn't concentrated enough. They did subsequently get into the London Assembly because that 5% was gathered together across the whole of London and got them one Assembly member in 2008-12. So unfortunately, this is it seems to be an inherent feature of many Western countries, and I think they need to be fully aware of this and the implications it has to all those various communities. At the moment, I've got to confess, I'm looking out, I think the Chinese communities getting a backlash at the moment. We've had this before with them, the yellow peril and things like this. That's where I think we've always had this, unfortunately, and it's always much easier to be attacking what's perceived to be an outsider when they're really not. And as I said earlier, when you suggested I was a liberal Muslim, if you look at the Quran properly in a theological basis, the emphasis of praise it gives to Isha and Musa, Christ and Moses, is something I don't hear enough about. And that's why I will always defend the Quran and defend the right for Muslims to say this is sacred to us.
Well, Mary is mentioned far more times in
There's a whole chapter about Lady Mary.
in the Bible. But we come to, if you like, deeper issues of free speech here. We're all against what this fellow did. But what about the people who are against what we do? What about the people who say, well, you shouldn't hold a demonstration supporting Russia, and if you do, we'll ban you. You don't have that freedom of speech. There are profound issues of where freedom of speech begins and ends, aren't there? Don't we want our cake and eat it, is what I suppose I'm saying. Don't we want our characteristics protected? But we are more than happy to criticize, attack, offend other people's characteristics. I mean, I'm never done offending Joe Biden, for example. Someone might say, I'm being cruel to him because he's an old man. Do you see my point? That once you start banning things, where do you stop, and who decides who's to be banned and from what?
Well, I think you make, where something sacred or holy is considered, you have to set a boundary. That should be off limits. And freedom of speech, but with a conscience. It can't be any kind of freedom of speech, no matter what. You can just insult and denigrate and, have some kind of decorum, some kind of morals about it, some consciousness, some conscience. So, but the sacred, that should be definitely the red line.
And that's completely different to political issues. Political issues are always up for criticism. I mean, what is our problem with the media? It's because the media is not free and fair. We criticize them banning, for example, Press TV, Russia Today, the censorship of the algorithms. So we really need to understand who actually has the monopoly over the media, right? Who is actually blackmailing the world with certain slogans, even going to the extent of justifying oppression within law and turning a blind eye to other things that are not of interest to them. So I think that is the crux of the issue. It's not a case of us having our cake and eating it. What we are saying is those things which are considered holy and sacred since the beginning of time. Religion has existed within the hearts and the minds of the consciousness of individuals, and this spans billions and billions of people across the globe. And so I think even labeling it as like hypocrisy, I feel like that's like the minimum level, because issues that are of political interest to them, that affect minority groups. Let's take, for example, the LGBT issue, for example, that affects minority people. But because there's a real political interest for governments to be proponents of it, and especially in the past decade, you see that it is being imposed upon people that don't even agree with it. Because, for example, Abrahamic faiths don't agree with that default position, but there's a kind of imposition. So, we saw that with the World Cup in Qatar, for instance, them having the One Love band, many people making that stance, not accepting it. But it's like, hold on, like it's respecting what individuals consider as sanctity that has existed since the beginning of time. And like the sister said, not trespassing that boundary.
But then at the same time, we should be able to speak out against issues like LGBT or whatever, homosexuality, whatever. I mean, whatever we
But
don't
these
have
things
the
are
right.
Because
sacred
it's a political.
to some
No,
people.
it's political.
You see,
It's
this
political,
is-
George.
But
It's
that's
political.
Well,
It's a political tool.
Well, we think so, but they don't think so.
But it's not
It's
the
not
same.
Quran
personal.
is holy to us,
George, it's
but
not
it isn't
personal.
holy to the man that burned it.
George, no one has a problem with anyone practicing LGBTQ. The problem is where? The problem is that now that is being imposed. So I can't go out and say that I, as a Muslim, maybe disagree with LGBT as a default position, as a practicing
prosecuted,
Muslim.
eh?
You would be
It's your job.
prosecuted if I said that. If I said that is
Scotland,
my-
you'd be in jail for hate speech.
Exactly. That is the problem over here, is that a minor issue is being imposed upon the majority of people because it fits within the real political interest of those in power.
Yes, but it's an example of the banning culture. It's an example of the cancel culture. You and I don't want our children to be taught that certain practices and so on are normal and equal to those forms of family that we believe in. So we're cancelled from criticizing it. We would literally be prosecuted.
Exactly, and that's the
But
point that I'm
we're
trying to
asking
make.
for the prosecution of other people's actions that we don't like. Do you see the
But that's
dilemma
not-
I'm trying to...
No, it's not a dilemma because you're comparing apples and oranges.
Exactly.
It's
It's not on
comparing
the
what
same
is a
level.
political issue. The LGBT now is a political ideology that is being put forward by governments. It's being pushed. One can't look at the issue and say it's not an agenda.
Everything should be able to be discussed and criticized. Just holy matters need to be treated with caution.
But that's because we're holy. What about all the people that aren't holy?
The majority are holy. The majority.
I wish that were so. I so wish
the
that were
international
so.
community is beyond Europe. We have to look at globally.
No, the majority
Holy
is
issues.
not holy. The majority of people in
You don't have
Sweden
to be.
are atheists.
Okay, we're talking
They don't
about-
believe in holiness.
We're talking about the
and holy
majority
books.
of the world over here. And we're especially talking about the minorities that reside within Sweden that feel endangered by this climate of hate. If we want to go back to the question of creating community cohesion, for example, and multiculturalism, why is it fair that they should feel endangered in that environment? Do they ask for terrorist attacks to be, done against them, for example? If we look at what happened in New Zealand, no. But it is ultimately that environment, that hate of hate that gets fostered. I'd argue it's not just a case of the far-right fanatics and extremism, but this is actually a structural issue, as Sister Catherine alluded to, within the media, and it comes from the top, essentially. It's governments that basically legislate policies, foreign policies, even domestic policies, that are so crucial to the lives of Muslims.
Well, what do you think? We've all got different points of view, and that's because this television program is called Kalima Horra. And thanks to Almayadeen, we were able to bring it to you. I hope you enjoyed it and that you'll discuss these issues long into the night. I've been George Galloway, and you have been a wonderful audience.